Thank you so much for everyone for joining. It's fantastic to see in the chat where you're all coming from. I'm tuning in from Birmingham, England, where we're actually having quite a dry evening. I think the sun's just gone, but we're heading into spring, and so there's that touch of light still in the sky. Um, Thank you for tuning in, and thank you to Carcanet for producing this book. I'm so happy with it. I should say also thank you to each and every editor, to John McAuliffe, to Jasmine, to Michael Schmidt, who've worked on this book with me, and to the artist who said I could use his painting. His name is Peter Jones, and he creates these amazing portraits of stuffed animals or stuffed toy animals. So I'm delighted when he suggested that I could use Snowball for the cover. And as you'll see from some of my poems that I'll be reading this evening and some of the discussion, this question around stuffed toys is a really important one for me. I also want to thank Jory Graham for being in conversation with me later. It is such a delight to have you here, Jory. You have been such an inspiration to my own work. And there are definitely questions here which I think both of us could be answering about time and scale. So I'm so looking forward to being in conversation with you. I'll read some poems, which Jasmine's going to share on the screen in a moment. There won't be a lot of introduction between the poems because I think most of the discussion will come when we get into the Q&A, and I'm delighted if you have questions for me. I hope I'll be able to answer them for you. So Jasmine, if we can start the screen share. Thank you. That's perfect. Forever, it appears. I wake and find it's day again. It happens every time. It makes no difference if I crush the day between my hands, or ring, or drop, or squish the day as if it were the frog. The frog bath sponge instinctively returns to its set shape. I watch its simple eyes, so soft, reopening like ours. Forever, it appears, expecting to be taken care of. So there are a number of different animals that feature in this book. There are real animals, there are wild animals, there are animals from social media, and there are stuffed toy animals, as I might have already said. And this felt really important to me. The first book, Significant Other, which Jasmine mentioned, had a kind of sequence that was focused on sea creatures, and particularly sea creatures that are far away from the human form, animals that we don't necessarily think of as animals, or even animals without faces. And in this book, I kind of wanted to create a democracy of animals, whether they were real or virtual, artificial, or something that we tune into when we're having a bad day at work and want to watch a kind of pratfalling panda or a cute little kitten. In this particular poem, we have a fainting goat. And the fainting goat is a particular goat that has a hereditary condition, which means that when it's very shocked or scared, its muscles freeze and it falls over. And I was really curious to find that this fainting goat has actually it's been bred to have this hereditary condition because people find this goat so amusing. And there's something obviously amusing, but also very cruel about the existence of the fainting goat. Head over heels. You tell me forever will take too long to add. Your initials finished, mine just starting into the trunk. We both know summer is coming to a close in this park with small petting zoo, a stray picnic blanket or two. The warden pretty much out of sight. I check once more, and watch as a wasp sheepdogs a huddle of children across the grassy stretch. Smaller than the others, one child remains beside the pen where the fainting goat is kept. The animal continues to observe its name every time the child tries a shriek or scream. Again, again, it's difficult to say which the child loves best, the goat or its four legs swiveling up to the sky. One day, I'll know that this was the most romantic way to tell me you carried a knife. My earliest memory. is looking from the cave and thinking the forest stupid because it would let me do to it anything I wanted. Bees were beginning to potter around a manifesto manifested in blooms and little grasses of what was promised freely: prairie, mountain, ocean, to I and the everybodies of avian maximums, bughoods, tacky amphibians. I was expected to permit love, claw, peace, nip me to pieces species, pleated cacti, even small waters of frenzy, with larvae like paisleys half dreaming of making me sick. What was financing this radical experiment, growing rapidly eccentric with oversharings of clown and cat-clothed fish, for which I had a soft spot, for which I had no use? Like the swamp I'd once played in, long ago grown out of. What can I say? I wanted nothing to do with it. And now, from where I speak to you, each beak, preachy dawn, coming quickly undone, I wait not knowing what the next big vision is, and already I am firmly behind it. I never really expected to be a poet who would write about steam trains. This came as a bit of a surprise when the steam train came into a few of the poems that I was writing for Baby Schema. This is one of them. There are a couple in the books about trains generally. There was a poem that featured Thomas the Tank Engine. He didn't quite make the final edit, but I'll read this one. And I'll say a little perhaps about my choice around why trains came into the poem. Um, and this was really to do with thinking about the Anthropocene. And this is a word which I think has just been rejected by scientists, by geologists, despite it circulating in our culture extensively. A word, of course, that thinks about our human impact on the Earth and us living in this new geological epoch. Many scholars date it from different periods. For me, I was interested living in Birmingham in this particular area of industrial revolution in which steam was so important. I started to think about how the Anthropocene was connected to steam and the ways in which we changed as a society, as a culture, with this new acceleration across the earth, with new pollution and with a general expansion. This is heritage. Like a glossy nativity scene, the barrels of pansies, the swept platform, the canopy's preserved supports, being repainted by a man in vintage overalls. And we are talking about where to go for dinner when in it comes, smoking like a cartoon baddie. But we are also talking about the days ahead, your job, and the station master checks the time twice, and you should leave the company. And where could we live? Tickets punched, fields open before us, tired from the outstanding summer again. We are talking about the mortgage and what we can set aside, while the choo-choo scatters some birds, which from here look vintage too, small, so pretty. And children, what could we offer them? Because we knew we had to wait until we found a good reason to have one. We'd heard about the farmer couple who sought to expand into peas and beans, and so had one, and later another, as did the family soap manufacturer that required more hands to release the soaps from their casts, which gave the impressions the soaps were made with loving care to meet growing demand. Understanding children to be the future who would go on to fix several of the world's most pressing problems. Some people, including our neighbours, had one. It lay like a sandbag in its mother's arms. Occasionally, I'd sigh, I just want one. We need a good reason. you'd reply without hesitation. Like this, quietly, a few years came and went. Then, one spring, in which every dawn came piglety, and the blossom trees were really putting in the work, I dropped an earring into the gap of the living room floorboards that only a small hand could retrieve, and I gave you the look, and you carried me up the stairs. So I think I should probably say something about the title of this book about baby schema. This is a phrase that comes to us from Konrad Lorenz, an anthropologist that was working in the mid 1900s. And he identified this set of visual features, and these are features that are generally thought of as being associated with babies: big eyes, chubby cheeks, a roundness of form, a stubbiness of limbs, and a general softness. And of course, this baby schema isn't just with human babies, it's also with animal babies, ducklings, puppies, kittens. And he suggested that these features are somewhat cute. I don't think he actually used the word cute, but we would use the word cute today. And that these features suggest a certain vulnerability. And that vulnerability prompts us to take better care and to love that baby schema even more. But as we know, baby schema doesn't begin and end with the baby. We find it everywhere. And once you begin seeing baby schema, these big eyes and chubby cheeks, and thinking about vulnerability and how that vulnerability is prompting you towards care, you start seeing it everywhere. Baby schema. I like the word mother only because I'm still a child, or want to be, the one cared for, no debt, nothing on file. To shrug off adulthood the way the statue on the street has let his stone head wear away to a chubby-cheeked, big-eyed roundedness that stares, bemused, perhaps concerned. How I stare when I see the child next door who drags a watering can between wilting shrubs like a child's and not at all. As Jasmine mentioned, there's quite a lot of thinking around extinction in baby schema. And one of the kind of extinction figures, I suppose, that I started to consider in the book was a tree frog called Tuffy, the last rab's fringe-limbed tree frog who died in 2016. And he comes up in the book at least twice. And this is a poem for Tuffy. This tree frog is going extinct. And so you should prepare yourself for sadness. This is what they told the woman. What kind of sadness? The woman asked, but they had already closed the door. She and the last of the species were to have exactly 3 minutes together. On a small square of moss, the tree frog sat stillish, as if it were a jelly doorstop. Each of its eyes stared like a magic 8-ball. She picked up the frog. Already 1 minute had passed. Is it a crying kind of sadness? She asked, directing the question to the amphibian. Most likely, one eye responded. The other eye concentrates and ask again. There had been a time when the magic 8-ball was easy to spot in people's homes, all manner of shops. Now, she realized, she hadn't seen one in years. From somewhere in the room, a croak, croak alarm began to sound, which seemed, even to her, insensitively chosen. The frog shut down its eyes. The woman thought about shaking it gently for an answer to a question she would formulate later, but it was time to go. I'm sorry for your loss, she said, so quietly she could have been talking to herself. So this is the kind of central sequence within the book, which is called Disneyland. And I was fortunate, or perhaps unfortunate, to go on a research trip to Disneyland back a couple of years ago in the writing of Baby Schema. And I call this a research trip because that's what I called it at the time. People have asked me what my research methodologies were, and I have to say that it mainly consisted of people watching, going on some rides, making a lot of notes, which actually drew a lot of attention to me. I don't think people usually get their notebooks out at Disneyland Paris. But for me, this was an important trip, and I'd never been before, and seeing Disneyland with adult eyes made me perhaps see things that I wouldn't have otherwise ever seen. So I'll read an abridged version of this sequence, and if you want to read on, then I suggest buying the book. Disneyland. Making eye contact with a squirrel for a second or three too long. I find myself still waiting for nature to wave back. Here, you can really get up close. A chipmunk knees a toddler over. It's a delicatessen of animism, and its shopkeeper is a mouse. He flings out his arms in welcome. Michael, whistling dreamster. Michael Mouse, minstrel gloved, four-fingered. No nursery of mites in your fur here. Air is textured with glockenspiel and popcorn. Not a leaf is out of place. One boy uttery with mommy, anticipating his 12 p.m. meet and greet with a lion. That they're capable of love. No one can be certain. Mothers in this particular landscape are, by tradition, evil or absent, and with my absent child, I sit in the shade of a castle, built in kind of, decorated in quite. Close by, a sparrow, very small, behaves as if this place is real. It's not, and knocks her beak against. I watch, a Thai green curry crisp on the cobbled floor. Several feathers, a like a wave, washed up untidily white on her side. Her flaxseed eye, unblinking, aloof. And all the time I notice this, a fly rests on my breast, like my breast's a piece of fruit in a 17th century Dutch still life. Alongside pops of wild west gunshots, a blown kiss from a princess floats above a duck who's nude below the waist. The kiss drifts up and over Edison Avenue, Rococo Scroll, Cheshire Cat and Caterpillar, the labyrinth grown from you in which the dodo's lost. Dressed in a damson overcoat, he's saying, which way, which way? Pipe in hand, he'll be lost forever, but extraordinarily good-humoured. And where, with all these boundaries crossed, am I, adjusting, and also my ponytail? Who? Billy Bob's mac and cheese, Arabian treasure, piles of looking salty. What is she doing with a notebook open? Am I something funny? Not wearing you, your ears, omnipresent, always unhearing. You, Michael of the wrist tattoo, Michael of the waffle, Michael of the band-aid pressed against a blistered ankle. And I'll finish with this poem, and then we'll invite Jory to come on screen and we'll have a conversation. This is Algorithm. Algorithm. The bowl has 3 pet peanuts, each one a peanut plant's attempt to outlive itself. My phone lights up like it's my mind with the thought of having a child. It suggests I watch This Lovable Otter Will Get You Through. The day is long, weather too much, but no more than we were told to expect. The bowl has 3 pet peanuts, each one a peanut plant's attempt to outlive itself. Should I repeat myself? How else to ride out time? When this lovable otter comes to an end, I play it again. Thank you so much. And yeah, welcome, Jory. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for you and this evening for us.
Hi, thank you so much. That was such a beautiful, incredible book. Echoes of some poets, even of Dickinson, and part of that long poem you read, but so original, so much your own invention. And I have to say, I've rarely seen short poems with so much packed into them, especially in this moment in our history of poetry. It's a remarkable work. I just want to ask you a general question. First of all, you know, you start out as and continue to be a brilliant echo poet. You turn into an echo techno futurist poet with a stuffed bunny on the cover of your book. And I think it's just, I'm curious, like, where did this project begin? Like, what's the, what was the seed and what happened? What put this in motion?
Thank you for the question, Jory. I mean, I think a lot of it began with Significant Other, with that first book, thinking about those sea creatures, which otherwise are so far away from the human form. I was researching at the time nature writing as creative practice, so how nature writing was being taught as creative practice at universities. And that involved quite a number of interviews with UK and US academics, nature writers generally, and I was asking them questions about how they were advising their students to write about the natural world, given so much change every year and so much anxiety around the future and what the environmental crisis looks like now and what it will look like in the future. And a lot of their anxieties when they were talking about their students' work, when I asked questions like, what are the challenges in teaching nature writing, were to do with anthropomorphism and were to do with cuteness. And I remember exactly one teacher coming back to me and saying, we had a session on wolves and writing about wolves, and these are wild animals, but all of my students said that they were cute. And of course, I understand that this is a problematic thing to be talking about wild creatures and saying they're cute, like they're puppies and kittens and like they're our pets. But I also thought it was interesting to lean in rather than avoid all these devices like anthropomorphism or anthropocentrism, where we're putting ourselves at the center. I thought, why not lean in and go an extra stage further than perhaps Significant Other did, where I was exploring anthropomorphism and pushing it almost to breaking points. I thought, why not explore cuteness? Because that really is where people are often turned off, especially when they're thinking about environmental issues which deserve a certain amount of reverence and respect. What can cuteness do in an age of ecological crisis? And my first thinking was very much that it can't do anything, and that cuteness is this the kind of stuffed animals and the pets, they're not real animals. And yet, as I started to work through my thinking, I went on quite a journey where I realized that actually my understanding of nature and eco poetry maybe could do with being opened out further. And one of the points that was useful for my thinking here was thinking about Jonathan Bates writing on eco poetry. So I'm sure you're familiar, and people in the audience may be too. He talks about eco poetry, bringing it back to its origins in Greek, and to oikos meaning home and poesis meaning craft. So the idea that we're crafting a dwelling place within eco poetry for us to live. And I suppose I started thinking about my own home. And you'll see behind me there's a little giraffe on wheels. I was thinking about my pet cat. I was thinking about the clothes moths that I'm having a real issue with in my home. And these natures, which aren't necessarily the pristine nature that we're thinking of, they're not the glaciers and mountains and countryside that we might want to hike in or find leisure time in, but they are nonetheless real and they have effects on us. We have attachments to them. So even though we're not talking about nature red in tooth and claw, as Tennyson described, we are talking about a nature that's doe-eyed and squishy. And even though the stuffed toy and the snowball on the cover may be far away from nature as it's defined usually, I still feel as though there is a connection there, however far removed that might be. So that's something about where the book came from, I think, in terms of the journey that was expanding the idea of nature to encompass the home and encompass culture, I think, to some degree.
There's a short poem called Campaign, where, I mean, you talk, I would love it if you would read it. You write, it's basically explores moving from one kind of emotion towards nature, which I think you were just talking about, which is sort of the sublime and the feeling of awe in relation to the sublime. And then you move it in this brilliant poem to a different kind of awe. One is spelled obviously AH and the other one is spelled AW. Could you just read it? Because it just seems to me to have the example of almost everything that you do, including this wonderful relationship, I think, to Peter Rabbit and to Beatrix Potter, the incredible internal rhyme that's throughout the book that is so masterful, and a way of summing up sort of the transition from awe with an AH to awe with an AW. So the fact that you could move from the sensations of the eco sublime and therefore the emotions about what it is so large that we stand to lose, to the awe, which is capable of finding sort of a level of admiration and complex emotion, not just, positive emotion, but fully formed complex emotions in the tiniest, most remote thing, those moths in your house looking for pheronems right now.
Yeah.
So
The miniature is really important to this book, I think. And I think maybe we'll talk about scale as we continue talking, and it's very much part of this poem, which, yes, I'll read it. It's called Campaign, and as Joy says, there's a difference between a kind of R, an AH, and a or, an AW in the work, which I'll kind of try to feed into my reading, but as it's such a new poem, I haven't had much time to practice it. So we'll see how this goes. Campaign. When awe succeeded R, awe preached the importance of a pebble's freckled onesie, ignoring the mountain and its storm. Where R had R over the ocean, awe now awed over the ocean dawdling, dawn-hued prawn. With R far gone, attention turned towards the 2-week seedlings of a lawn. A buzzard hunted, yawn paused lizard, one carrot, awfully small. How big the world became as it possessed once more the petty four of insect eggs, a chicken's moon-clipped claws.
it's so beautifully written. I have to say, it's extraordinary. I hope people will buy the book and just study these unbelievable sounds. There's practically this Hopkinsian density, and yet it just fluid. This idea of the having awed over the ocean and now being able to awe over the pebble, and as you say, the wonderful pebble's freckled onesie. I mean, how can that one not love that image? Does bring us a bit to the question of scale. You've basically decided that from awe to awe, you're going to reduce the scale. And the question that I had for you, I mean, there's not just a preoccupation with time, but with scale. And, you do treat small and large in terms of scale, but also ecological and capitalist, reaches by which we have to think about the smallest objects that we encounter. I just have a slightly interlocking question here. I wonder if, given that, and I'd like you to just talk about scale in general, but given that you're interested in scale, is there a way in which you're asking whether the human can grow small enough? It's not just that you're interested in the small, but you're asking us to consider our scale, and you're asking us to reconsider our scale. And so the question is, for me also, doesn't poetry ask us that as well? In other words, do poems all ask us to change scale in order to inhabit them? And how does changing scale affect our sense of time, which I think is another big concern in the book? Does time getting bigger make us get smaller? Can we delay extinction by certain kind of mental practices, or does poetry dilate time in order to defer extinction, or at least give us the illusion of being able to defer that fear that you talked about at the beginning, so that we can inhabit the present tense of our lives in a way that's compatible with actually living and not just surviving.
What a fantastic question. I feel like I could live with that question and try to inhabit it for the next probably a few years. And maybe I will as I go on to write the next thing. I mean, with thinking about scale, it's fascinating, that question around the sublime versus the miniature and the small, and what that does to our own sense of scale. And my immediate thought is thinking about the feeling that we have when we're surrounded by that kind of sublime nature. We are often felt to be humbled. We're often made to kind of think about our scale and how small we are in relation to the earth and these landscapes. But I almost feel as though that sense of feeling that we have, that kind of overwhelm that we might feel with the sublime, we also get from the very small. And that this, although the scale changes, the scale of feeling stays the same, that we are overpowered often by cuteness and by the small things that we might feel enchanted by. And maybe this links into questions around wonder and the natural world, because I often find it's the very small things on earth which I lose myself to. And it certainly happened with the first book, where I was looking at limpets and barnacles, and I felt like my sense of self disappeared in relation to these very tiny creatures and overlooked creatures. And again, with thinking about, I suppose, some of the dawn-hued prawn and the yawn-paws lizard, again, those are moments where I feel like the self is kind of evacuated. So maybe that does speak to the human and the ways in which the human changes scale with the poem. I've really intrigued recently to read, I think it's Susan Sontag, on miniaturization and miniature and how our sense of time. I think there was a study which she quotes where people who spent time with dolls' houses as adults found that the scale they were working with also changed their sense of time, and that the scale almost linked to the size of the doll's house, so that people thought that they were spending a lot longer time looking at these dolls' houses than they actually were. So I think there's definitely a relationship between scale of what we're seeing and then the scale of time and the scale of inhabiting. What that means for the poem, I'm not sure. But it's interesting because I think with time, and I know Jasmine said at the beginning of today's event and in my introduction that I'm a writer of short poems, and that's true. But in writing this book, I really wanted to challenge myself with line length and with thinking about punctuation, so losing full stops. So in the poem I read earlier, My Earliest Memory, there's this idea that perhaps by lengthening the line, I could go back somehow to early man, to early humans, and kind of find in the line, the poetic line, a tracing back to a kind of first person eye that might go as far back as a kind of caveman, which sounds really grand and bold. And I wasn't expecting it at all, but it kind of just came as a prompt. And there was something about the breath inhabiting the line, which was really important to me, following this breath, which was following the breath across scale and time. And feeling it, even when I'm reading that poem out loud this evening, feeling where my lungs are straining, because the scale is so impossible to traverse. And yet I think, with your own writing, of course, that's been such a milestone for me in thinking about the ways we can address the future and look back within a poem. In terms of extinction, I'm not quite sure where to even begin thinking around time and scale, because that again is just such a vast scale to be thinking of. And when we're thinking about loss, it's so hard to be identifying loss, because loss is loss. And so we're not seeing the thing, we're seeing it disappear. And to see something disappear, of course, it's not visible, makes it difficult to our faculties, which are so visually focused on what does exist. So I might not answer that question, or I might ask you to keep asking me about extinction, and I'll see if I can find an answer.
I think that you've answered it beautifully, and I wanted to ask you one emotion that comes up in the range of the cuteness issue, and that is you speak about what you call the explicitly loving gaze of a soft toy. You wonder about whether it's benign, so you've given it a lot of characteristics, and then you consider whether its love is indiscriminate, and that's very much like the eye of technology upon us. It loves everybody equally, and it's indiscriminate. And I think that there's a link there between the eye of these creatures, the fact that you chose to write about many creatures that didn't have faces beforehand, but that has. I would love for you to talk about just what you talk at one point. You say, "Wow, the newt's stare." Okay, and this, so you have the animal, you have the stuffed toy animal, and you have the eye of technology, and they seem to have a gaze on you, which is not the human gaze. And the poems seem to be written into those gazes, which is what makes them so remarkable, because their compression is if it was written for well, what Bishop, would so understand your change of scale. She's such a, it's such a phenomenal part of what her vision involves. Could you talk a little bit about the feeling of that gaze upon you, and making, you talk about making eye contact with a squirrel in another poem, and it just seems like this strange way in which you're unsettled by and reorganized by a kind of, I don't want to put an adjective in front of the type of gaze or stare. I would like you to.
I'll see if I can find my way to an adjective as I answer the question. I mean, I think so. I had this sudden, I don't want to say breakthrough or brainwave, I'm not quite sure what the right word would be, but I had this moment last summer when I was heading to a conference which was based at the Oxford University Natural History Museum. This is a really fantastic natural history museum. Ruskin was involved in the architecture and the design. I really recommend, if anyone wants to go to Oxford, to go to the museum if you haven't already. I was on the way to this conference, which was thinking about taxidermy. It was thinking about stuffed animals, curation, extinction, how we display and communicate science relating to extinction and biodiversity. And on my way to this museum, I found myself navigating this summer fair, which Oxford has every year. And it was full of students and people from Oxford. And there were these huge soft toys, these stuffed toys everywhere with their eyes looking out, or in some cases not, because they were all compressed into bags. And I suddenly had a realization that I was kind of stumbling into these stuffed animals on my way to see differently stuffed animals in this museum. And I realized, of course, the stuffed animals in a museum, they're seen as objects of study. We interact with them differently. But there was something about the way in which we objectify animals and the ways in which we consume animals, I suppose, both as stuffed toy and stuffed animal. And the ways in which we are, when we go into a museum like the Natural History Museum, all these animals are placed looking outwards. You'd never go into a museum and find all the taxidermy facing away from you, although I'd love to explore that as a possible choice in curating a natural history museum. So this made me kind of evaluate my different relationships to different animals. And the poem that you're talking about, Squeezable, where I'm talking about this loving, this explicitly loving gaze, there's something so generous about a stuffed animal. And we were talking just before the event started about the hippopotamus that you were thinking about bringing in to the session today, a stuffed hippopotamus. I don't have a stuffed toy to hand, but in some ways they're incredibly generous creatures. They are looking at us 24/7. They are waiting to be squeezed, waiting to be touched. And in other ways, they are without agency, without character, without really anything, within the shell of their cute selves. So I find that kind of contrasting quality really fascinating. Um, and I suppose thinking about technology and extinction, bringing this back round to extinction and the eyes. I mean, of course, a lot of our relationships are face-based. That's so important to us. And there have been many writers to talk about that relationship with eye contact. But I think there's also something about the individual animal. So as I was writing this book, I was thinking about different scales of animality when we think about herds and hordes and swarms and flocks, and the ways in which those are kind of anonymous and often quite threatening scales of animal. Whereas when we start to see extinction having an effect, and we have, say, Tuffy the tree frog, who becomes an individual, just one last individual of his kind, there's a whole different relationship to that animal and to the eyes. Again, I think Tuffy, because he's a tree frog, was a tree frog, his eyes are so important to our relationship with him. But it's not just the fact that he has a face, it's the fact that we give him a name like Tuffy, that we relate to him in I guess, a more kind of loving manner than we ever would before, because he is this endling, as we often describe, which I think itself is an interesting word to describe the last individual of a kind of species. So I don't know if that helps to answer that question around eyes, and the technological feeling around eyes is a really interesting one. I mean, I think cuteness, as I said, is so much part of this book, and technology and cuteness is, I mean, it's everywhere. We see it in politics. We see certain ways of describing the ways that we're living. We see it in advertising all the time and in trying to get us to buy certain things. So this eye of cuteness, which is, at once kind of vulnerable and engaging, I think is everywhere. It's prevalent.
That's a beautiful answer. I mean, there's so many questions that I could ask, including, how the temporality of a relationship with a stuffed animal or a wild animal that you're gazing at, or how the temporality of that relationship alters your relationship to temporality itself. And, you do say these extraordinary things at one point, I think in the poem Algorithm, I think you read from it, you say, when this lovable otter comes to an end, I play it again, as if there's a kind of loop in time that you can inhabit when you're encountering cuteness, or when you're encountering anything that's in the techno world, or anything that's using you to sell itself to you. So in a capitalist loop. So as long as it can awaken artificial desire in you, it will get you to use it, and therefore it will exhibit its cuteness to do that. And so there's a kind of unextinguishable, theoretically, hopefully from the capitalist point of view, completely unextinguishable force or current that you're put into. And it's in that place where I sort of feel like the gaze, to me, one of the interesting things that is everywhere in this book is the appropriating gaze of the technology that's using you to get to you to use it. And there's a moment, I think it's in the same poem, when you say, shall I repeat myself? How else do I ride out time? And this idea that, as opposed to moving in linear time, which is where extinction exists, and where by facing into it we are terrified, you find a way, without escaping that feeling, you find a way to get yourself into a circular time. A loop is one word that you use for it, but you use many other words. This repeat yourself is another one. By the way, the repeating of yourself is everywhere in the incredibly strong internal rhymes in the book, so that it's formally also constantly hearing itself and echoing itself, and in that chamber creating an unextinguishable, maybe against extinction, kind of riding out of time. And I think that riding out time is a very interesting concept in this book, because it gives you a place to live in during this terrible Anthropocene.
Thank you so much for picking up on that, Jory. I'm aware of time, and I'll give a kind of shorter answer so we can allow some Q&As to come in the final 10 minutes. But I mean, yeah, one of the words that keeps coming up in the book, and which I hadn't realized until I was quite late on in reworking the manuscript and getting it ready for publication, one of the words is forever, which keeps being repeated in the book. And that was such a shock to me. Forever isn't a word that I use particularly often. And I'm still kind of curious as to why that's in the book, but I think it has a link to the idea of looping, repeating, and the fact that, yes, with the lovable otter that will get you through on YouTube, you can just replay the video, and we have these animal presences, presumably for as long as our humanity and our culture and our technology allow us to have those presences. There was a really frightening study I read recently that suggests, and this is through kind of empirical research in the social sciences, that the virtual presences of animals in our lives, and this I mean in terms of soft toys and the ways in which you might have jumpers or socks with, giraffes and lions on, these virtual presences are actually making people think that animals are prolific in the wild, when in fact these animals are becoming extinct, and lions and tigers being a good example of this. So there's a real question here as to whether those virtual presences that technology are allowing us, whether they are, pandas that we're seeing on Instagram videos or YouTube videos of slow lorises and other, quite endangered species, whether this is a positive thing in terms of connecting us to the natural world, or in fact, kind of suggesting to the people that these animals are fine, that there is no extinction facing them at all, which I think is a real challenge in terms of thinking about the virtual presence versus the real presence.
I would love to follow up with a question, but I think the audience has some questions.
Thanks, Jory. So I have a question here. I think you've sort of touched on this to start with already, but to expand on it, maybe a question from Michael, who says the longer lines seem to have two caesuras. It's very Stevensian in a way, and the reading is carefully paced, leaving lots of space for the reader. The poems are generous because the I is not the subject. Is that a fair characterization?
Oh, fascinating. I had to go back and look at my own poems, Michael, I think. And I want to see that question again. Can I see it in the chat? Yes, I can. The poems are generous because the I is not the subject. It's interesting. I mean, I feel as though there's a lot of me in this book, a little bit more than the last book. But at the same time, I don't think it's an I that I feel encapsulates me. I think, a little bit like Sharon Olds, we can talk about the apparently personal poem, and whether the I and the personal are the same thing, I think is probably a whole other topic. I like the idea that the poems are generous because the I is not the subject. And I think I probably need to go back and look at that. I think, again, thinking about scale and Jory's question around the human and whether the scale of the human is changed by the poem is something maybe interrelated to this question. And in writing the book, I was thinking a lot about scales of the earth and the human and how much that has changed just in the last, well, kind of 4 decades or so. And PN Review recently published an article of mine called Baby Earth Environmentalism, where I start to question whether or not our culture is still holding on to this idea of Mother Earth, or whether in fact baby Earths are coming into our environmental discourse. And I think here particularly around human hands holding up the earth that we see often in environmental and ecologically conscious rhetoric. And this kind of miniaturization of the earth, I think, is maybe part of reimagining the I and reimagining the human in relation to ecology and maybe to the earth itself. But I feel like I'm getting super big here, so perhaps I'll kind of wrap up that answer and see what other questions we might have.
Thank you. So we have a question from Francesca, who says, I was really interested, Isabel, in what you said about how a project on teaching eco-poetry had expanded your sense of what an eco-poetics might be for baby Schema. I wondered if you could say a bit more about the relationship between your critical work or scholarship and the writing of poetry, and how the two things might nourish each other.
Thanks, Francesca. Yeah, great question. I think always the reading that I'm doing, however critically informed or, however dense that reading may be, is informing the poems. And that's always been the case for my writing. With my journey on cuteness, I found that a really large kind of turning point in my thinking came from cute studies, and just the recognition that cute studies exists as an emerging scholarly field. And this is a scholarly field that is thinking around cuteness in terms of its power dynamics. Cyan Nye is a really good theorist here who talks about the powerlessness of the cute object and how vulnerable and small that might be, and how in relation to the cute we become larger. So again, thinking about scale and kind of the idea of human domination, I suppose. But cute studies has also looked at really positive possibilities of cuteness and the ways it allows us to connect and open our moral circle. And so I think some of that discussion, that more academic discussion, helped me to open my mind to cuteness in a way that perhaps I had closed off at the very beginning of my thinking around the aesthetic. And has probably allowed me to be a little bit more generous with the topic than I otherwise wouldn't have, and allowed me to interact with soft toys and my own cat called Maisie, who's not with us this evening, but she's around, in a way that otherwise I wouldn't have done. So thinking about the generosity of cuteness certainly was something that came from academia and which I wasn't expecting, but has really influenced the writing.
That's really interesting, and we do have a question that really ties into this here from Lisa, who says, do you think cuteness is a dangerous aesthetic? Does it encourage an easy cruelty and supremacy towards the natural world, which leads to a Disney mentality? And if so, what is the antidote, do you think?
Antidote. Thanks, Lisa. Great question. I mean, I've kind of for the project for this book, I've tried to be as open-minded as possible. And so, yes, I think there are real dangers of cuteness. And I think I spoke to those as we were discussing slow lorises and pandas and the ways in which we might forget all about extinction taking place and the threat that these animals are facing. And pandas, of course, are actually back from the brink of extinction. They're no longer classified as endangered, which is good news. And part of me wonders if that's down to cuteness and the fact that they are this conservation icon globally, thanks to the charity WWF. So in some ways, you know, cuteness may be rescuing animals, and in other ways, cuteness is putting them into real peril. So I think it's both and. I mean, I think there's no either or. It's kind of both and. Like, we have to think about cuteness as both a positive and a negative, and to say one over the other isn't probably going to be useful to us. I'm curious as to what cuteness will mean in the future, because it has this particular meaning at the moment, especially in Western contexts where we look at the etymology of cute and it brings us to acute and to the idea of cleverness and to shrewdness. So there is this feeling, at least in Western forms of cuteness, where manipulation is baked into cuteness and we feel manipulated, and maybe that's why we reject it. It has designs on us. But when we look at, say, the Japanese culture of kawaii, which is often translated as cuteness, then we don't see that shrewdness, that manipulation in that word. And therefore, I think kawaii is a lot more positive in its kind of social appeal in Japan. So, you know, culturally, I think cuteness is different. And where it goes next, I don't know.
Thank you so much. That brings us to time. I'm sorry to say, it was such a pleasure to sit here and hear you guys discuss this book. And yeah, you really opened it up for me as well after having spent so much time with it. So I hope you guys all enjoyed yourselves as much as I did. Thank you, Jory, for doing this for us. Like, really appreciate it. And obviously, congratulations, Isabel.
Buy the book.
Yes, buy the book. I'm putting the link in the chat for you guys. Thank you for paying your £2 to be here. Please use the discount code on the website. Buy a copy for all of your friends. And yes, I think, yeah, that's everything. Oh, please join us next time. We're launching another book next week by Roland Bagnall. That's in the chat too. Come along, sign up to our newsletter. Don't miss any books or events. Okay, thank you guys.